Hey there, memers. Welcome back to a podcast about self help using memes. I'm your host, Blake Moore. Today's episode is How I Self Care for Anxiety with Memes. This will likely be one of many episodes on the topic of anxiety, but if Lao Tzu taught us anything, it's that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. This is as good of a place to start talking about anxiety as any. Let's get into it, memers. Welcome back, memers. Today's episode is How I Self Care for My Anxiety with Memes. Anxiety is a big subject, but as a reminder, I am not a medical expert. This is self help using memes for a reason. Memes are ways that I deal with my anxiety. These ideas or suggestions are how I help myself, literally. Some of them are tools for identifying what I'm feeling is anxiety. Some of them are tools for processing my anxiety after I've identified it. I'm sure we'll talk about it more than once, but let's get going with this today. Specifically, we'll talk about defining anxiety. We'll talk about breaking anxiety feedback loops with easy math, and we'll talk about using probability to be in charge. First up, though, is the meme of the day. So, for the meme of the day, the meme in a podcast about self help using memes has a very specific social science definition. So, I mean something very specific when I say that. By meme, I mean a concept or a term that has a pervasive definition that extends across people and time and circumstances, and that when people see it, they largely understand it to hold the same meaning whether it really makes sense or not. They just kind of understand it to have the same meaning. For a fuller explanation, there's actually a whole episode about it in my YouTube channel. Check it out now. It's the first one. For now, here's an example for this episode. It's Pokemon. Pokemon are a meme, right? Like as a thing that people talk about as a concept. Each individual is its Pokemon is a meme. All of their evolutions are a meme. The concept of evolution is a meme. The genre of Pokemon is a meme because then you have things like Digimon or the card games or lunchboxes. My kid is actually checking out Arceus right now. And so I've talked on Twitter just asking people what their favorite Pokemon are. So when I say a podcast about self help using memes, one of the memes I'm talking about is Pokemon because kind of everything is a meme. So with the meme of the day being Pokemon, I do also want to take a second for some housekeeping. I want to acknowledge my very first YouTube subscriber. Thank you very much, Roller Dude. You're literally the first person to subscribe to my YouTube channel. So thank you. For those of you that are not Roller Dude, it's called a podcast about self help using memes. You can find it on YouTube. If it doesn't matter to you how you consume this content, please consider liking and subscribing on YouTube. I really appreciate it. If you would like to see shorter form content or perhaps written content throughout the day instead of audio content, you can find me on Twitter at Blake Writing. So, with the meme of the day and the housekeeping out of the way, let's actually talk about anxiety. First up, what does anxiety even mean? In defining anxiety, we have to talk about what that means. And so I define anxiety as being generally concerned about something, more specifically, whether it will or will not happen. And so I can be anxious, worrying that I will get a raise or that I won't get a test result that I want, right? Like anxiety works both ways. And so when you define it that way, you can kind of start to see anxiety everywhere. And so if anxiety and worry become synonymous, and for a lot of people, they're not. But for mild anxiety, that can be synonymous with worry. And so you can be worried about making enough money or about whether your kids are going to grow up like right, whatever that means, or whether you're a good spouse. All that stuff is really just anxiety. Anxiety doesn't have to be big to affect how you think about that because as you go through your day, you're dealing. I mean, it's disingenuous to say I deal with my spouse or my kids. I like my spouse and my kids. but those are the interactions that you have throughout your day. You deal with those things, whether those are work or your spouse or your kids. And so little worries over a long enough time in true big piggy bank fashion add up into problems that affect you. And so you don't have to be worried about quote unquote big problems for them to affect you in a big way. Those absolutely add up to one big thing. You can be anxious about a bunch of little things, really. And so, consequently, since those are things we face every day, having a decent set of tools to mentally deal with your own anxiety will help you. And that's what the rest of this episode is about, or if we have future episodes or content about. These are what I've come to label tools for how I deal with my anxiety. And my anxiety and yours may not be the exact same. But once we know what anxiety is, we can look for it and we can look for tools to address it in ourselves. And so I find it productive to address that anxiety. And so the remainder of this episode or any future content, rather than defining anxiety, will be how to identify it and how to deal with it. And so coming up next is breaking the anxiety feedback loop using easy math. This section is breaking anxiety feedback loops with easy math. If you're anxious or worried about something, do what you do if you were driving and you were worried you were going too fast. And for me, that's I check the speed limit sign. Sometimes it can take a while for one of those to come up, depending on where you are and how frequently that's posted. But I check the speed limit sign. Um, I use that as a metaphor a lot because I'm honestly anxious about a lot more stuff than just whether I'm driving too fast. And so if I am generally anxious about something, I try to specifically find more out to measure myself and compare to. And so driving is an easy example because if I'm worried or anxious that I'm speeding, I can just check the speed limit sign. I can measure myself using my speedometer. I can compare it to the speed limit sign and then determine objectively whether or not my anxiety or my worry has a basis in reality. I know whether or not I'm going too fast or not based on my self recorded speed in the posted speed limit sign. And for me, that's where the anxiety ends. I had a concern. I looked up the answer. I looked up how I was performing compared to that answer. And I just stopped being worried about it. Um, People with anxiety disorders find that part hard to shut off. So I will say that my advice doesn't work if you have some sort of diagnosed anxiety disorder or perhaps anxiety medications. Again, these are what work for me, but just telling someone, so don't be anxious, might be something they already thought of, right? So I clearly don't mean it that way. But if you ever have a negative thought that just won't quit bouncing around your head, like for example, if you've ever worried that you've done something wrong or you're messing up something important or you're worried that you're not going to be able to get something done, here's what I do when that happens to me. Picture the absolute worst case thing that could happen as a result of the thing that you're worried about. So, for example, if you're having an argument with your spouse or a bad work review, or you've done something and you're worried about getting in trouble, right? Whatever that is. What's the absolute worst case thing that could happen? So, like, is your spouse going to ask for a divorce? Will your boyfriend or girlfriend break up with you? Will your boss fire you? Are you going to get arrested, right? And so once you've pictured what the worst outcome is, that's the first step, right? Picture the worst. The second step, what are the odds of that actually happening? Like for real. And let's just stick with work, right? If you're worried that your boss is going to fire you, has your boss ever said something to the effect of, one more late report on my desk and you're fired, or anything like that, right? Like, what are the odds of that happening? Like, you're on thin ice with your spouse, or like you're well aware that if you get arrested one more time, you're going to jail for a long time. What are the odds? That's the second thing. So, the first thing, what's the worst case? The second thing, what are the actual legitimate odds of that happening? And so the third thing for me is to make a plan if that horrible thing ever were to happen. And oftentimes that part can get really uncomfortable because if you're picturing things like your marriage or your work, picturing a worst case scenario isn't necessarily something you'd want to do, right? But in this scenario, again, if I'm talking about relationships or I'm talking about work, if I got fired for being incompetent, I'd try to go find another job. I'd also hope that I didn't get fired for being incompetent, but whatever, right? If the horrible result of my action is that I get fired, I'll go try to find a different job. If my spouse asked for a divorce, I'd be very surprised, but I'd ask for like a conversation to talk about that or counseling together, right? That's not something that I want to contemplate, but it's absolutely something that I can and have developed a mental plan for, right? And hopefully I never need that. But that's step three, is to make a plan if the horrible thing ever happens. And then step four, and this is where it all comes together. Once you've made the best plan that you can, just kick it out of your head and move on to something else. Like, I literally just develop a plan and then I stop thinking about it. That's not to say that you won't ever think about it again. You will. But if you do, work to end that line of thought and then move on, right? Process your steps, ending in your plan for if that horrible thing you're worried about should take place. Work through the problem, trying to think of ways that you've accounted for issues you might have overlooked, including working back to your solution all the way, at the end of your formula, and then stop. And that's it. Just leave it alone. Move on to something else. Stop thinking about it. It takes mindfulness for sure, but even meditating monks have unwanted thoughts that pop into their heads during meditation. Work through it, dismiss it, and then think about what's for dinner, or go turn on a song you like. Anything to change the subject, like mentally speaking. One warning or disclaimer: this advice, like the rest of the advice I give, isn't meant to replace therapy since I'm not a therapist. It's also not meant to replace medical advice since I'm not a medical professional. Some content is best left to professionals. My advice is useful for figuring out how to mentally approximate things like, am I a bad husband or am I a good mother, in more tangible terms. Make a plan for it and then try not to think about it again isn't the most sound advice for all circumstances or issues, especially if trauma is involved. If you're anxious or worried about something, do what you do if you were driving. And if you were worried you were going too fast, just check for the speed limit sign. Figure out what that means for your thing. Gather data, measure yourself, compare it, and then resolve your anxiety. One concrete example, and again, I'm not a substance abuse expert, but one concrete example would be if you're worried that you drink too much or that you have a drinking problem. Google that, right? Like, that exists. That's a measurable amount of things. Like, check it out. Um, but with that, it should make it where you can gather data and understand which side of the line you fall on. And so, with that, we'll kind of wrap up this section and move on to the next section with just kind of putting it all together, to using probability to be in charge. The last section in our first episode about anxiety is using probability to be in charge. I do want to stop here for a bit and talk about just what are the odds of that happening, which is a phrase we used in the previous section. You're welcome to come to this conclusion in your own way, but I've got a method for estimating that's a little bit of debate and a little bit of Texas Hold'em, but it works for me most of the time, and now you can use it too. To decide how seriously you should take something, you take the probability of an event happening and multiply by the impact or the effect of the thing in question. And so, in that paradigm, big but unlikely events like getting divorced or going to jail can get weighed against smaller, but way more in the realm of real everyday responses. It lets you compare them. In debate, when I was using this method, it sounded something like, based on the evidence presented in this round, there's an 80% chance that if you vote for the other team, that you'll cause an economic downturn, which leads to an economic depression, and depressions are bad. And we've got evidence for all of this. So please vote for me, or the fake people in my fake example don't lose their jobs or cause a nuclear war or whatever, right? In poker, it sounds something like, There are 9 cards left in the deck to make my flush. 5 of the same suit is what a flush is if you don't play. With 2 cards left to go, I've got a 36% chance of seeing those cards over the next 2 cards, which would be like the fourth and fifth ones. If the pot's $100, I should view a $36 bet as my maximum amount before I fold, since that's my likelihood to win the hand at 36% odds, right? In poker, you also get into things like bluffing and expected value, but those are more factors that warp the math than actually change it. The thing is, they're both poker and debate, really just calculating the odds that something might happen and trying to do something with it. In debate, I was trying to get a judge to vote for me. In poker, it's for fun or money, depending on how you'd like to play. You can't always and won't often know the specific likelihood of some things happening, but you can try. In poker, how many clubs are left in the deck is a known quantity that we can use to calculate stuff. Does the judge think I'm believable when I talk? Or how often would a good dad do something like this are a bit hazier, right, to calculate. Let's stick with the am I a good dad example. If I were anxious about being a good dad, I'd ask myself questions like, has anyone ever said you're a bad dad before? What are some example behaviors from bad dads that you know of from the media or real life? Do you do any of those things? I've more than once realized that the only one putting pressure on me is me, but that's kind of like a meta example. Another example of something with really big consequences, but also really low probability of occurring in the first place, I can think of is pirating music. I looked it up for last year. In 2021, music piracy happened primarily through the taking of music from streams. Like you go to Spotify and take the music off and then use it somewhere else or whatever music stream is popular. In 2002, it was services called Kazaa and LimeWire. In 2021 or 2022, when people want music, the internet's good enough to stream it on demand. But back in the late 90s and early 2000s, lots of people just downloaded music regardless of whether or not it was legal. I've got no clue historic numbers of all the illegal songs downloaded ever, but as of March of 2021, it was 1.3 billion songs per year. Um, the second thing to take into account when we're doing the math here is the RIAA, which are the people that sue you if you illegally download music, appears to be done suing people. They sued about 18,000 people total. I'll let you play the home game for the math, but my point is that yes, there were very big consequences for a few people that got sued when they pirated music, but by and large, that was a high consequence, low probability event. The current probability of getting sued by the RIAA for pirating songs isn't zero, but it's like pretty close to zero, right? I think of it like a baseball batter who swings like they're trying to get a home run every time, but can only connect to the bat to the ball like 18,000 out of billions of swings. Big impact, but really low probability. Anyway, enough of a sidebar into probability math. Back to the thoughts you want out of your brain, right? Like anxiety. Once you can entertain thoughts without letting them run the show, you'll feel at least a little bit more in charge of those situations. Having a plan just feels better. So some of that sense of control is likely just a lingering placebo effect from the planning process. But still, I mean, I'll take what placebos I can get, right? That's it for today's episode, memers. Thanks for giving it a listen. Today we talked about what anxiety is, how to break some of those feedback loops using math, and finally how we can use odds and probability to be in charge. The best way you can support my content is to like and subscribe to it on YouTube or follow me on Twitter at Blake Writing. Till next time, memers. This has been a podcast about self-help using memes. Thanks for listening.